Hi.
Good evening, or I suppose perhaps good night. I have another story to read to you, and hopefully you'll find it enjoyable. Yet again, it's written in the style of ancient historians and ancient histories, so I would not necessarily rely too much upon the specific facts of it, but hopefully you can enjoy the general story. I certainly find the time period interesting. Anyway, let's begin. The waves swirled about Dan-no-Ura, but for the moment the world there was at peace. To the north, back in ancient history when it was still the east, the land was full of bandits, and the government was being overthrown. An era was dying. A slaughter had raged inside the capital. For a moment, the blood on the streets had looked like the dying sun at the edge of the end of day. The children of the Minamoto had been killed, almost to a man, and almost every child had been killed by a cruel tyrant, a hegemon named Taira no Kiyomori, a murderer, and history knows him by no better epithet. His cruelty, however, had not been complete. He had spared a child, Yoritomo. This was the man who would grow up to overthrow him. Had his cruelty been more complete, he may have been spared. In sparing this child, he condemned himself and his entire clan to death. But even in dark times, when the clans and nobles controlled everything, light was not entirely lost from people's hearts. The crime of murder, of so many innocents put to death, and the gray and gilded city lanes of the capital, spilled and stained with blood, had horrified people where the deed remained only a rumor, there, in a free land where men did more than whisper. And so a torch was raised and brought about, and the clans that lay among the hills touched it to the effigies of peace, and in the night they assembled and marched away under the firelight of those effigies and the light from the burning countryside. Despite being famous for being the best warriors in all of Japan, the Minamoto, surprisingly, relied upon night assaults and strategically rushing the backs of their opponents. Thus, these first and most celebrated of samurai were actually quite at odds with the chivalric traditions of their time. Initially, suffering reverses despite what must have been regarded as cowardly tactics by the honorable men of the time, the power of the Minamoto slowly grew. Yoritomo had as his advisor Hojo Tokimasa, a man who held his position for no other reason than that Yoritomo had desired his daughter, back when Yoritomo was still a wanderer and poor, a man who slept in houses that weren't his own. However, Tokimasa was a man who was jealous of power, scheming, and as history would eventually show, murderous. Therefore, perhaps only coincidentally, Yoritomo did the wise thing and kept Tokimasa. Away from the capital, sending him out instead to convince clans to betray the Taira. And so, over old Japanese roads that wandered like birds, this counselor walked the land, spreading dissent. Well, we should consider it no wonder that there was such dissent, because there was much resentment in those rural parts. I will tell you something, though you will be surprised. The Heian Japanese, whose world was about to be overthrown, regarded anyone beyond a few miles of the capital of Kyoto as a barbarian. Even in their courtly literature, anyone from the east was shown to be without beauty or without knowledge of grace, and they were like human dogs. With such resentment, the shunned and abused took up arms. Thus, while in the capital they had been studying silk and colored dyes, in the provinces far away, where it might take half a year to journey, the power had slowly been slipping away from the court. And it was from the hands of these people that the later daimyo would emerge. The descendants of these barbarians would in large part come to define Japan. But while the story of the machinations of this Hojo Tokimasa are worth telling, for the moment this is not our tale. Instead, we speak of the attack upon Ichi-no-Tani. For a while, the Minamoto, traitors to the throne and yet loyal, had been suffering a series of reverses and failed retreats. But through the use of traitors and hard-picked, carefully timed treacheries, they had gained momentum, and the tide had turned against the Heiki. But the Heiki remained strong, though they were, perhaps, mired in old chivalric traditions. The Minamoto wanted to launch a death blow at them and expel them from Honshu, that they might drown in the waters instead, without a land and without a cause. The commander of this battle for the Heiki, if it may indeed be said that anyone commanded them here, was Taira no Tadanori. He had spent the day before the battle composing poetry. And indeed, the poetry was very pretty and asked after by a nearby monastery. But we cannot help but think this shows us the contrast between the brutality of the Minamoto and the naivete of the Taira. Truly, in the Genpei War, two different worlds clashed, and I am sad to say, the more brutal one survived. The other did not. Taira no Tadanori had sent his trusted advisor before the battle to secure for him a choice parchment for his work, a thing that was fine and famous from Korea, and that was good to preserve her work from all ravages of time. Meanwhile, the Minamoto were out and about in the hills, and through the roads they walked, and were with fire burning over the years, the many fine places of the Heiki. So in this world, the finest of luxuries are no assurance of immortality, while the fire that lives for a mayfly's life, and an easily chipped metal blade, are far better guarantees of longevity and survival. Within almost sound of the waves that would be their last home, not knowing this, and thinking themselves safe, the Taira encamped on a valley in a narrow pass. Perhaps, warriors of a courtly tradition, they sought the head-on battle that, so far, the Minamoto had been denying them. In any case, they would be disappointed of that, for here again, the Minamoto clan won by doing what few were willing to do. Some 300 or 400 years before Oda Nobunaga, the forces of Minamoto Yoshitsune stood upon a hill. An almost sheer descent stood before them. It is said that, at the time, illuminated only by starlight, a single white feather, perhaps from a swan or a Japanese tanchozuru, drifted along. The wind, and then after a while it stopped and plunged down into the valley below. This was regarded as a bad omen, but Yoshizunare remarked that the feather had only been meant to show them the path, and that they should ascend upon the Taira like birds, and that they would lose their feathers, though they should attempt to take flight. And indeed, considering their future history, One must remark that the Taira would have done better to model themselves after fish, for the symbol, Mon, of the Taira clan was in fact a moth. We must remark it was indeed ironic that the Taira were defeated by a force that favored night attacks. The Taira had risen high in pursuit of glittering light and the Emperor, only to be burnt by the night torches of the Genji. But the Heiki would not be the only victims of the rage of Yoritomo. The great hero, Yoshitsune, would ultimately die of murder, slain by his own brother with a distant order from Kamakura. So the Minamoto, on their small and stout Japanese horses, stood on the precipice, and silently, without a word, Yoshitsune disappeared off the edge, and his warriors followed him. Not wishing to share the honor and glory equally, the Heiki had placed their lesser warriors in the rear, that the great and noble ones might have the honor of the opening combats, the ones that most tended to be spoken of and remembered. So, left to their own devices, the underlings had fallen to drinking and hunting and fired off many arrows at the living creatures of this land. Sanctity and the sacredness of life meant nothing to them. Unfortunately, it meant little to the warriors that were coming to kill them either. So, in that regard, I am not sure we can say this is karmic judgment. Yoshitsune, however, had always been afraid of heights. Rather ironically, given that he was also afraid of people finding out that such a famous hero was also quite short. However, in any case, Yoshitsune had acquired his fear of heights from a mishap that had happened while cliff diving during his rural childhood. I cannot, though looking through deep distances of time, help but wonder at this point if that childhood mishap did not cause his short stature. But Yoshitsune, riding with the fervor of a man who has conquered his fears, appeared at the head of his samurai. Having done this brave thing, he proceeded to fire many arrows into drunken sleeping men. Who is to say what could have been done? I can only tell you what has happened, what was done, and what things occurred. And to each side that there is a victory, there is a tragedy. The hope of the Taira faded after Ichi-no-Tani. So we see the leaves in the glittering world of the capital. Autumn has come when the leaves change their color. What once was bright and green has now changed to even brighter hues, but the leaves are dying, and it is a final swan song. The world of the capital would never be the same, and what once had been would never return. It had been a very peaceful world, where people competed over position, and laws were hardly needed at all, or even enforced. But what would come was a world of brutality, and those harsh laws would endure for centuries, the legacy of the Minamoto clan. And so I say to you, good night. Remember that to all good things comes an end, but also that all sadness and pain ends as well, and our dreams and our thoughts are like a man who views the sky while he is looking up from underneath the waves. May you find your dreams to always be happy ones, regardless of what shall visit you.